Hi, my name's Grace Leary. I'm the programs manager at the Little Compton Historical Society. Our talk today will be given by uh, Alan Hoffman. The talk is going to be specifically about Lafayette and his role in the American Revolution, and then his evolution into a anti-slavery advocate. Alan has been talking about Lafayette for quite a while, as I understand it. Originally learning about him after obtaining a BA in history from Yale and then a JD at Harvard Law School, excuse me. Um, uh, Alan discovered Lafayette in 2002, and then has been doing some amazing research since then. One of those things includes translating first account of Lafayette's farewell tour of America, which was originally written by his secretary and then translated. And then Alan has also spoken over 260 talks about Lafayette in all of the 24 states that Lafayette visited during his farewell tour. So this is we're honored to learn more about Lafayette from someone who knows him so well as you can. And I will hand it over to you, Alan.
Well, thank you, Grace.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, let me just add real quickly that if we have any comments or questions during the talk, if you want to uh, add those into the comment section, and then we'll go back through them at the end of the talk. Sorry, Alan.
oh, that's okay. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to present to the Little Compton Historical Society. What you forgot to tell them was that I've been a summer resident of Little Compton for 50 years now. Time really flies, I must say, and we love Little Compton. This talk has two parts, but I hope you'll find at the end that there is a relationship because, in my view, it was during the American Revolution and his experiences with African Americans in the Continental Army that Lafayette became an anti slavery advocate. So Lafayette was born in Auvergne, France in 1757 at the Chateau Chavignac, which is the first slide. Um, First slide, please. There it is. Having inherited a prestigious title and great wealth upon the early death of his father in the 7 Years' War in 1759, and later his mother, his maternal grandfather, and paternal grandmother in the early 1770s, Lafayette traveled to America in April of 1777 to join our revolution on a ship purchased and provisioned with his own funds, carrying with him a commission in the Continental Army, which purported to make him a major general. At the time, he was only 19 years old and a mere captain in the French army on furlough, no less. Having landed in Georgetown, South Carolina on June 13th, 1777, Lafayette began his journey from South Carolina to Philadelphia. He was introduced to General George Washington at a city tavern in Philadelphia on July 31st, 1777, and invited to join his staff and serve initially as a volunteer without a command. His charm and what we would call today his winning personality quickly won Washington's friendship. In Lafayette's memoir, he recounts this anecdote. On the day of Lafayette's arrival in camp, some miles from Philadelphia on August 8, General Washington was reviewing his 11,000 ill armed and worse clad troops. He remarked to Lafayette, according to Lafayette's memoir, quote, "We must feel embarrassed to exhibit ourselves before an officer who has just left French troops." Lafayette replied, "I come to learn, not to teach." And that modest tone, Lafayette writes, which was not common in Europeans, produced a very good effect. His baptism by fire took place on September 11, 1777, 5 days after he turned 20, in the Battle of the Brandywine, which was part of the British Army's successful campaign to take our capital, Philadelphia. Next slide, please. I like this map because you can see the big red line going around, and that's the famous flanking operation. The Americans believed that the bulk of the British Army were coming over Chad's Ford, which is at the south part of that map. But a column led by Lord Cornwallis crossed the fort about 8 or 9 miles from the American troops and surprised them, and the American right flank started to falter. The battle was turning into a rout, and Lafayette, the volunteer major general without a command at that time, obtained permission to join the fray. He galloped forward, drew his sword, and successfully urged the troops to cease their retreat and turn to face the enemy, which would give the rest of the army time to retreat. He was shot in the left calf, and when his boot filled with blood, he was carried off the field. The next slide is an engraving of Lafayette wounded at Brandywine. As he told a reporter in an interview that he gave to Paulson's Advertiser in 1825 during the farewell tour, when he revisited the field, he was taken to a farmhouse and placed upon in Chester and placed upon the dining room table while the doctors worked on his leg. Just then, a group of American officers burst in. Lafayette looked up and said in his broken English, "Gentlemen, you look hungry. I hope you don't think I'm dinner." Recuperating with the Moravian community in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Lafayette missed the Battle of Germantown, but he rejoined the army and was sent with a small number of troops on a reconnaissance mission in Gloucester, New Jersey. On November 25th, 1777, he and his troops attacked a column of Hessian soldiers, causing them to retreat, took some prisoners, and returned to camp. Both General Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island and General Washington were duly impressed, especially as in his reports, Lafayette gave most of the credit to his troops. By December of 1777, Washington was so impressed with the young man's courage, prudence in war councils, and character that he petitioned the Continental Congress, a civilian authority, to give him a field command. By December 19th, when the Army entered its winter quarters at Valley Forge, Congress had approved, and Washington put Lafayette in charge of a division of 3,000 troops, which was not an inconsiderable part of the Continental Army. Next slide, please, which shows Washington and Lafayette at Valley Forge. The year 1778 was full of action for the young Major General. In February, the War Board, the reigning civilian authority, sent Lafayette north to invade Canada against the wishes of his commander, Washington. When Lafayette arrived in upstate New York, he found troops ill-fed, ill-clad, unpaid, and short of ammunition, so he called the invasion off. While there, however, he traveled to the settlements of the Oneida, Americans' loyal Native American ally, assisted them with fortifications, and recruited 47 warriors for the Continental Army who joined his division at Valley Forge. Shortly after Lafayette's return to Valley Forge in April, news of the Treaty of Alliance with France that had been signed on February 6, 1778, arrived, boosting the morale of the Continental Army. On May 18, Washington sent Lafayette with 2,200 troops, including many of the Oneida warriors, to find out what the British were doing in Philadelphia. Loyalist informers alerted the British, who surrounded Lafayette's army with a size most reports suggest was over 16,000 troops. At Barron Hill, Pennsylvania, now called Lafayette Hill, on May 20th, Lafayette made his greatest escape, returning to Valley Forge with only modest casualties. 6 Oneida died in the engagement and are honored by a stone marker in St. Peter's Episcopal Churchyard in Lafayette Hill. The British, learning that a French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing was sailing to America, decided to evacuate Philadelphia and headed for New York City on June 18th. In a war council, it was decided to attack. General Charles Lee, a senior general who had once served in the British Army, opposed the decision. Therefore, Washington assigned Lafayette to lead the attack. When Lee changed his mind and asked for the command, Lafayette stepped aside. On that brutally hot day, June 28, 1778, more men died of heat prostration than of bullet wounds. As Lin-Manuel Miranda tells us in the musical Hamilton, Lee ordered a hasty retreat. Washington, after hurling obscenities at Lee, took over the command and preserved a draw. The arrival of the French squadron under the command of the Count d'Estaing on July 8th led to the Rhode Island campaign in August of 1778. During this campaign, Lafayette and the troops that he and General Greene had brought from the American encampments in White Plains, New York, to support the invasion of Aquidneck Island reached the ramparts of Newport. Now, the next slide is a map which just shows the area of Aquidneck Island. The troops all crossed from Tiverton, and they went all the way through Portsmouth, Middletown to the ramparts of Newport. You can see at the bottom some of the batteries of Newport. The next map, which is a contemporary map, actually shows what happened on August 10th. The French fleet sighted a British fleet coming up from New York in Rhode Island Sound, and through the Middle Passage, they left and passed the batteries, undergoing some shelling, and engaged the British. A nor'easter took place. Both fleets were damaged, and the French fleet, instead of coming back to support the invasion, headed for Boston for repairs. The American commander, General Sullivan of New Hampshire, was very angry at the French. In his public orders, he criticized the French for leaving the scene of an invasion. Lafayette was designated to ride to Boston by horse, which he did, over 50 miles, and to negotiate with his cousin from the Auvergne, d'Estaing. Although he was not successful in that negotiation, he did manage to keep the alliance, the new alliance, from falling apart. He then returned to Rhode Island in time to participate in the evacuation, which was successful. There were no losses, 10,000 troops to Tiverton. For his service in that battle, he received a congressional commendation from the Congress. Lafayette returned to France on furlough from the Continental Army on the frigate Alliance, which sailed on January 11, 1779. The next slide is the iconic portrait of Lafayette during the American Revolution by Charles Willson Peale. A hero in two worlds, he was also considered the expert on the cause of the insurgents, as the Americans were called, which France had now fully embraced. In that capacity, he lobbied for more money and material, and most importantly, for a French land force to be based in America. The memorandum, which he wrote to Foreign Minister the Count de Vergennes in July of 1779, became a plan of action for France to pull the Americans over the finish line in the war with their mother country. One historian of the French role in the American Revolution titles the chapter in which he discusses this memorandum, quote, Lafayette to the rescue. It is certainly fair to say that he and Benjamin Franklin were most responsible for the decision made by the French court to decide this aid, to send this aid in 1780. On March 17, 1780, Lafayette sailed back to America aboard L'Hermione to tell his paternal friend Washington that help was on the way. The next slide is a detail from a historical portrait of 1782 of the ship, the frigate Hermione. And the next slide is the replica ship which sailed to America in 2015. From aboard the Hermione at the entrance to Boston Harbor, actually Marblehead, Lafayette wrote Washington on Thursday, April 27, 1780. I have affairs of the utmost importance that I should communicate to you alone. He disembarked from the Hermione at Boston on April 28 to a hero's welcome and spent several days in Boston before traveling to Morristown, New Jersey by land, where he imparted the news to Washington on May 10 that the French expeditionary force under General Rochambeau would be dispatched to America's shores. Rochambeau arrived with his 55-man army and a squadron of ships in July of 1780 at Newport, Rhode Island, which the British had by then evacuated. The arrival of the French expeditionary force was Lafayette's greatest diplomatic triumph in the American Revolution. His greatest military contribution to the American cause was the Virginia campaign in 1781. The Virginia campaign from April to September 1781 was the occasion of Lafayette's most significant independent command, and it proved to be a severe test of his military and political skills. His small cadre of continental soldiers were ill-equipped, and the Virginia authorities were incapable of providing substantial support. Yet this campaign led to the greatest American victory of the war, Yorktown, and Lafayette's role in it was the most significant military achievement of his entire career. It started out with a whimper, not a bang. In Maryland, in mid-April, Lafayette faced the possibility of large-scale desertions from his 1,200-man force, many from New England, who feared the southern climate and whose uniforms and shoes were disintegrating. By letter dated April 17, 1781, to General Greene, from what is now Havre de Grace, Maryland, Lafayette described his situation this way. My first object was to get the troops on this side of the Susquehanna River, and request the militia officers to pick up deserters and send them to me. Immediately, I then made an address to the detachment, which, enforced by the difficulty of crossing the river and the shame I endeavored to throw upon desertion, has almost entirely stopped it. Lafayette told his men they were free to go. Ahead of them, he said, by a hard road was great danger and a superior army determined on their destruction. He, for one, meant to face them, but anyone who did not wish to fight could avoid the crime of desertion by simply applying for leave to return to camp in Morristown, which would be granted. Given the option of fighting or declaring themselves to be unpatriotic cowards, Lafayette's men stopped deserting, and several of the deserters returned remorsefully and were allowed to stay. One who did not return was later caught and hanged. In his April 17 letter to Greene, Lafayette continued, and as our brave and excellent men, for this detachment is extremely good, are shockingly destitute of linen, I have borrowed from the merchants of Baltimore a sum on my credit, which will amount to about 2,000 pounds, and will procure a few hats, some shoes, some blankets, and a pair of linen overalls, and a shirt to each man. I hope to set the Baltimore ladies at work for the shirts, which will be sent after me, and the overalls will be made by our tailors. The ladies of Baltimore complied with his request, and the troops received a set of new clothes. In a letter dated May 24 to General Washington, Lafayette reported that he had succeeded in removing the public stores and private property from Richmond, the capital. Because he was seriously outnumbered by British forces and faced a shortage of supplies, he had determined to skirmish, he wrote, skirmish, but not to engage too far. The alternatives were quite unacceptable. Was I to fight a battle, I'd be cut to pieces, the militia dispersed, and the arms lost. Was I to decline fighting, the country would think herself given up. So Lafayette essentially stalked and harassed Cornwallis and the British forces he commanded as they marauded in Virginia. In fact, Lafayette was badly outmanned, having less than half of Cornwallis's 7,500-man force, even including the Virginia militia, until General Anthony Wayne arrived with an additional 1,000 Continentals on June 10th. Thereupon, Lafayette stepped up his pursuit of the British as Cornwallis headed for a deep water port under instructions from his commander-in-chief, Henry Clinton. On July 6, 1781, near the Green Spring Plantation in Jamestown, disaster nearly struck. Following Cornwallis's tracks as the British general led his troops from Williamsburg across the James River, Lafayette and Wayne decided to attack the British rear guard after the bulk of the Redcoat Army had crossed the James. Cornwallis, however, decided to spring a trap. He sequestered a large part of the army, hidden from view about a mile from the American posse. As Wayne was about to lead 800 men against what he thought was a small rear guard of British soldiers, Lafayette smelled a rat and, reconnoitering, saw that the main body of the British army was still on the near side of the James. He rode furiously to warn Wayne, but it was too late. Wayne, seeing a tidal wave of redcoats, ordered his men, bayonets drawn, to head straight for the red wave. The British were stunned for a moment and hesitated to press their advantage. Meanwhile, Lafayette galloped into the fray with 500 additional troops, and the two generals managed to retreat with only modest casualties. As Lafayette wrote to his brother-in-law, the Viscount de Noailles, who was serving in Rochambeau's army, on July 9, 1781, "This devil Cornwallis is much wiser than the other generals with whom I have dealt. He inspires me with a sincere fear, and his name has greatly troubled my sleep. This campaign is a good school for me. God grant the public does not pay for my lessons." Then, in what seems like an aside, he continued, "My fine horse was killed under my groom." Having received intelligence from an enslaved man who was a spy in Cornwallis's camp that the British had begun fortifying at York, that is Yorktown, as Lafayette wrote Washington on August 25, 1781, Lafayette continued his pursuit of Cornwallis, setting up camp near Williamsburg in early September. In the meantime, the French West Indian fleet under the Comte de Grasse had arrived in the Chesapeake in late August, and in early September offered to land 3,000 French troops under Saint-Simon and additionally 1,800 sailors. With this influx, Lafayette would have had a force somewhat greater in numbers to the British force at Yorktown. De Grasse urged Lafayette to force the issue with Cornwallis immediately so that he could resume his primary responsibility, the defense of the French West Indies. Lafayette, a prematurely mature 24-year-old, demurred. He would not spend the lives of his forces in a battle of equals when he knew that Washington and Rochambeau would arrive shortly with forces that would add another 8,000 troops to those now under his command. He also believed that his paternal friend Washington and fellow countryman Rochambeau had earned the right to preside over what he believed to be the final act of the American Revolution. 43 years later, in a speech on October 27, 1824, at the Capitol in Richmond, Chief Justice John Marshall, another Revolutionary War veteran who knew Lafayette from the American Revolution, put it this way: during the Virginia campaign, you, quote, so happily tempered the enterprising courage of youth with the caution and prudence that belong to riper years. The Battle of the Capes, one of the most important naval battles in American history, took place on September 5 as de Grasse's fleet sailed out to sea to meet and repel successfully a British fleet dispatched by General Clinton from New York to rescue Cornwallis. On September 14, 1781, Washington and Rochambeau and their troops arrived at Williamsburg. The siege of Yorktown, essentially orchestrated by French engineers and powered by French artillery, began on September 17. The last two British fortification redoubts 9 and 10 fell on October 14, the former stormed by French troops and the latter by American troops under Lafayette's overall command, with Alexander Hamilton leading the charge. Yes, the code name was Rochambeau for the operation, and the troops were ordered to empty their muskets of ammunition, lest an accidental firing spoil the surprise, as in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. Surrender negotiations began on October 17 at the Moore House in Yorktown. The Allied commissioners were Colonel John Lawrence, a friend of Lafayette's and Hamilton's, as we know from the musical, who had also been involved in the taking of Redoubt number 10, and Lafayette's brother-in-law, the Viscount de Noailles. When the British soldiers refused to look at the Americans on surrender field on October 19, Lafayette ordered the American band to play Yankee Doodle. According to one account, the British were so thin-skinned at this pleasantry that many of them smashed their arms in anger while laying them down on the slopes. On the next day, October 20, Lafayette wrote the first minister of France, the Count de Maurepoix, as follows: the play is over. The fifth act has just ended. I was a bit uneasy during the first acts, but my heart keenly enjoyed the last one. The last major engagement of the American Revolution had ended with a magnificent Franco-American victory. The next slide is an engraving. This is a later strike, but it was done in 1782 in France. It's Lafayette at Yorktown. The image of Lafayette looks like it could have been made from life, and the rest, of course, is imaginary. Now I'm going to turn to Lafayette's evolution as an anti-slavery advocate. During Lafayette's farewell tour in 1824 and 1825, Americans not only acknowledged his important role in the American Revolution, but lauded him for his universal approach to the betterment of the human race. In Pembroke, New Hampshire, for example, on June 22, 1825, Stephen Webster, Daniel Webster's brother, said, quote, "We admire that persevering activity with which you have sought all possible occasions to ameliorate the condition of the distressed." In Concord, New Hampshire, later on that day, at a banquet for 700 on the State House lawn, one toaster described, there were 35 toasts, by the way, one toaster described Lafayette, quote, as the universal philanthropist. Lafayette's human rights portfolio over his career included such causes as national revolutions to create independent nation states, religious freedom, freedom of the press, anti-slavery advocacy, rights of women, support of Native Americans, support of public education, expansion of the suffrage, prison reform, and opposition to the death penalty. At the core of his human rights advocacy, however, what was his 50-year opposition to slavery. Yet, when the 19-year-old freedom fighter arrived in South Carolina in June 1777 to join the American Revolution, He was at best a blank slate and at worst naive and obtuse with respect to chattel slavery. In a letter to his wife from Charleston, dated June 19, he wrote, "In America, there are no paupers or even the sort of people we call peasants. Every individual has an adequate amount of property, a considerable number of Negroes, and the same rights as the most powerful proprietor in the land." In March of 1779, while Lafayette was on furlough in France, and after France had regained control of Senegal from the British, Lafayette wrote Franklin, who was at Passy, that he rejoiced not only for the victory for the Allied cause, but also because, quote, "the Southern gentlemen of America would be pleased to get Negro slaves again from that place." 5 years later, on October 17, 1784, James Madison, who had spent a month traveling with Lafayette during his first of two victory laps across America, wrote to Thomas Jefferson that one of Lafayette's three hobby horses in politics was, quote, "the manumission of slaves." The others were the alliance between France and America and the Union of the United States. In the sense used by Madison, hobby horse, which is a child's toy, means a preoccupation or even obsession. Lafayette's evolution on the issue of slavery is traceable, in my opinion, to his experience with African Americans in the American Army. First, he commanded troops that had African Americans among them. In this regard, the First Rhode Island Regiment stands out. It consisted of enslaved blacks and Native Americans whom Rhode Island recruited by promising them their freedom if they served for the entire war. They saw combat in August of 1778 in the Rhode Island campaign, an unsuccessful effort by the Americans to take Newport back from the British. The next slide is a modern painting showing that engagement during the Rhode Island campaign. They came under Lafayette's command in September when he was assigned to defend the mainland from a possible British counterattack. The survivors were part of the combined Rhode Island Regiment in September and October 1781 when they served under Lafayette's overall command again in the siege of Yorktown. When Lafayette was visiting New Orleans in April of 1825, at his request, he met with African American veterans of the War of 1812. According to the Courier newspaper of New Orleans, quote, "The general received the men of color with demonstrations of esteem and affection and said to them, 'Gentlemen, I have often during the War of Independence seen African blood shed with honor in our ranks for the cause of the United States. I have learned with the liveliest interest how you answered the appeal of General Jackson, what a glorious use you made of your arms for the defense of Louisiana. I cherish the sentiments of gratitude for your services and of admiration for your valor. Accept those also of my personal friendship and of the pleasure I shall always experience in meeting with you again." The general then kindly shook hands with them all and thanked the governor for the opportunity he had given him to become acquainted with them. Second, there is Lafayette's relationship with James, an enslaved man whom his enslaver, William Armistead, volunteered for service under Lafayette during the Virginia campaign in 1781. James proved to be a reliable double agent in General Cornwallis's camp. Among other intelligence that he provided to Lafayette was the news, as we have seen, that the British were fortifying Yorktown. In 1781, while Lafayette was in Virginia in his first post-Revolutionary War visit to the United States, he wrote a testimonial in support of James' petition for his freedom, outlining the important services that James had provided. In 1787, 3 years later, the Virginia legislature granted James his freedom. James was so grateful to the general that he took his surname and called himself James Lafayette, or some historians now believe James Fayette. The next slide is a broadside. It was actually made after the fact in 1830. The image of James comes from an 1824 painting, but it shows the testimonial that Lafayette wrote in support of James' petition. During the farewell tour at Yorktown on October 18, 1824, Lafayette spied James in the crowd that had assembled to greet him on his return after 43 years. According to the Richmond Enquirer, quote, a black man even who had rendered him services by way of information as a spy, for which he was liberated by the state, was recognized by him in the crowd, called to him by name, and taken into his embrace. Such public displays of interracial affection were rare in both the antebellum South and the North. As William Cooper Nell, an African-American historian and abolitionist from Boston, wrote in his 1850 history, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, Lafayette was not, quote, tainted with American color phobia. By February of 1783, Lafayette's view on slavery was substantially evolved. In a letter to his mentor, George Washington, he proposed a plan, quote, which might become greatly beneficial to the black part of mankind. He wrote, let us unite in purchasing a small estate where we may try the experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants. Such an example as yours might render it a general practice, and if we succeed in America, I will cheerfully devote a part of my time to render the method fashionable in the West Indies. If it be a wild scheme, I had rather be mad that way than be thought wise on the other tack. Although Washington replied that the proposal is, quote, a striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart, and expressed a willingness to join his protege in so laudable a work, he never did. Instead, in 1785 and 1786, Lafayette purchased plantations in Cayenne in the French colony of Guyana on the northern coast of South America. The next slide is a map of the northern coast showing where Cayenne is, where Lafayette's plantations were. There, he hired an overseer and gave him strict instructions as to the lenient treatment of the black workers and the implementation of a policy of education and gradual emancipation of the workers. Sadly, the experiment came to an abrupt end when Lafayette's properties were confiscated in late 1792 after the radicals gained ascendancy over revolutionary France. Lafayette had fled to the Austrian Netherlands in August of 1792, hoping to get to England and America, only to be imprisoned for 5 years by Prussian and Austrian monarchs. The importance of this project to Lafayette is illustrated by a letter which he wrote to his wife's aunt from prison in Magdeburg, Prussia, in March of 1793. At the time he wrote this letter, he had little or no information about the status of his wife and children in France. But in this letter he wrote, I do not know what has happened to my plantation in Cayenne, but I hope my wife will see to it that the blacks who farm it preserve their freedom. During the late 1780s, before the French Revolution, Lafayette had joined abolitionist societies in France. That one was called the Société des Amis des Noirs, Society of the Friends of the Blacks, in England and in New York, where he enrolled in the New York Manumission Society. One biographer, Jason Lane, noted that in 1788, he would become the first person to be involved in the abolitionist movement on an international level. With respect to his American friends who relied on the labor of enslaved workers, Lafayette spoke truth to power. During the controversy over slavery in the newly formed states that led to the Missouri Compromise in 1821, ex-President Jefferson wrote Lafayette to explain his theory of diffusion. Jefferson believed that slavery should be allowed in all the new territories by diffusing slavery all over the country. It would relieve overcrowding in the tidal areas to the benefit of everyone. Lafayette's response in a letter dated July 1, 1821, to one of his closest American friends seems somewhat scathing. Are you sure, my dear friend, that extending the principle of slavery to the new raised states is a method to facilitate the means of getting rid of it? I would have thought that by spreading the prejudices, habits, and calculations of planters over a larger surface, you rather increase the difficulties of final liberation. Was it not for that deplorable circumstance of Negro slavery in the southern states, not a word could be objected when we present American doctrines and constitutions as an example to old Europe. Nearly 50 years after Lafayette's farewell tour visits to Monticello, and he visited in both 1824 and 1825, Israel Gillette Jefferson, a former enslaved worker there, wrote about a conversation he overheard between the general and Thomas Jefferson. Lafayette remarked that he thought the slaves ought to be free, that no man could rightfully hold ownership in his brother man, that he gave his best services to and spent his money on behalf of Americans freely because he felt they were fighting for a great and noble principle, the freedom of mankind, that instead of all being free, a portion were held in bondage, which seemed to grieve his noble heart, that it would be mutually beneficial to masters and slaves if the latter were educated. This conversation was very gratifying to me, and I treasured it up in my heart. At Montpelier in 1824, Lafayette engaged his old friend James Madison and his neighbors in a debate over the issue of slavery at dinner. Lafayette lobbied Chief Justice John Marshall in 1825 by sending him an anti-slavery pamphlet, Benjamin Lundy's A Plan for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in the United States. Although his anti-slavery views were well known in America, Lafayette did not generally publicly advocate for them on his 13-month farewell tour. He likely pulled his punches in deference to many of his hosts, who were slaveholders. Yet he repeatedly took actions privately and in public which signified that African Americans should be treated as equals and with a recognition of their dignity as human beings. He greeted or was greeted by African Americans in many places, including New York City, Troy, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Yorktown and Richmond, Virginia, Columbia, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and as we've seen, New Orleans and Concord, New Hampshire. In Manhattan in September 1824, Lafayette visited the African Free School, the creation of the New York Manumission Society, of which he was a member. There, the star pupil, James McCune Smith, I'm going to show you the next slide, is a 1824 engraving of the school, actually made from a drawing of a student. There, the star pupil, James McCune Smith, an 11-year-old enslaved boy, gave the welcoming address. General Lafayette, in behalf of myself and my fellow schoolmates, may I be permitted to express our sincere and respectful gratitude to you for the condescension you have manifested this day in visiting this institution, which is one of the noblest specimens of New York philanthropy. Here, sir, you behold hundreds of the poor children of Africa sharing with those of a lighter hue in the blessings of education. And while it will be our pleasure to remember the great deeds you have done for America, it will be our delight also to cherish the memory of General Lafayette as a friend to African emancipation and as a member of this institution. James McCune Smith was the first African American to earn a medical degree. He had to go to the University of Glasgow, Scotland, because of American color phobia, and he opened the first Black-owned pharmacy in New York. McCune Smith also wrote important scientific papers and was an abolitionist and close friend and associate of Frederick Douglass. The next slide is an engraving of James McCune Smith. During the farewell tour, a number of southern cities and towns had passed ordinances or made proclamations prohibiting blacks, enslaved or free, from attending public events like parades or militia reviews involving Lafayette. This was because of their concern about his possible influence on them. Columbia, South Carolina may have been one of them. After the parade and the militia review on March 11, 1825, there was a reception at a private home for Columbia's elite society. Pompey Fortune, then a free black, who as an enslaved man had waited on Lafayette in South Carolina in 1777, barged into the reception asking for Lafayette. According to an account by a militiaman who was present that day, Lafayette recognized Pompey, shook his hand warmly, and called for a glass of champagne, which that worthy took with great dignity. Afterwards, Pompey said goodbye, and they shook hands away again. By the way, those Southern municipal officials were right to be concerned about Lafayette's influence. Lewis Hayden was an enslaved boy in Lexington, Kentucky, when Lafayette arrived in 1825. He told this story in a memoir he wrote late in life. Hayden was standing on a fence on Lafayette's roof. He was the only person on the fence. When the general passed, he bowed toward the fence. Now, Lafayette would bow to both sides of the road as his carriage passed. Hayden looked around, saw he was alone on the fence, and he became frightened, so frightened that he ran away to a different location where there were more people. He actually ran under where the artillery was going to fire a salute in honor of Lafayette. He concluded, Lafayette was the most famous man I had ever heard of, and you can imagine how I felt as a slave boy to be favored with his recognition. That act burnt his image upon my heart so that I never shall need a permit to recall it. I date my hatred of slavery from that day, and I tell you that after I allowed no moving thing on the face of the earth to stand between me and my freedom. Hayden escaped first to Canada, then to Boston, became a leading abolitionist. About 25% of the escaped slaves were given refuge at his home. It was part of the Underground Railroad. Later in life, after the Civil War, he became a public servant, a politician. The house where he and his wife Harriet lived is on the African American Freedom Trail in Boston. The next slide is a photograph of Lewis Hayden later in his life. Lafayette even had a posthumous influence on the abolitionist movement. A statement attributed to him by his good friend, the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, was published in 1846, 12 years after his death. Clarkson said in a letter published in William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator on January 2, 1846, that Lafayette was decidedly as uncompromising as any on the subject of slavery. He has said frequently, quote, I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery. When this statement was published in 1846, Lafayette was the most popular man in America as a result of the farewell tour. His popularity is exemplified by the publication of a full-color broadside in New York entitled Pictorial History of the United States. The next slide, please. So you see in this broadside that the seals of all the states and territories are in the perimeter, and then there's printed information which included censuses from 1790 and 1840, a list of eminent men, list of battles of the American Revolution, the War of 1812. There are three major figures. Next slide, please. Washington, Franklin, and Lafayette under the title Pictorial History of the United States, not Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, Madison, or even Jackson, but a Frenchman, Lafayette. Now, between 1846 and 1865, abolitionists like Charles Sumner and Wendell Phillips quoted Lafayette's anti-slavery lament, the one that was published in the Liberator, in speeches and publications. A broadside quoting Lafayette's lament, amplified by exclamation points, was published in Boston in the 1850s. The next slide from the Boston Public Library's Garrison collection shows that broadside. The exclamation points are added. This broadside was observed on the wall at a memorial service for John Brown in late 1859. According to Harvard historian John Stouffer, Charles Sumner's signature speech of the Civil War was called Lafayette the Faithful One. Given first at Cooper Union in New York on November 30, 1860, the speech became a best-selling pamphlet, and Sumner delivered it many times during the war. The timing of the speech was just after Lincoln's election and during the secession crisis, and some Republicans were getting cold feet. Sumner hoped with this speech to reverse the movement towards compromise. Quote, "We Republicans must be faithful to our anti-slavery principles," he urged, as much as Lafayette had been faithful to his vision of democracy and equal rights. Wendell Phillips, the celebrated orator of the abolition movement, when asked for his autograph, customarily wrote a statement of a famous person, attributed the statement to the source, and then signed his own name. He most often quoted John Brown. For example, he is known to have written this above his own autograph. John Brown taught these lines to each of his children: peace if possible, justice at any time. In May of 1864, Phillips paraphrased Lafayette's anti-slavery lament. Next slide, please. This is it's a engraving of Phillips with a facsimile signature, and on the right is an autograph in which Phillips wrote, "I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I had thought that thereby I was helping to found a nation of slaves." Next slide, please. You can see from the close-up that after Lafayette, he signed Wendell Phillips, May 64. So it was that the abolitionists used Lafayette, the most popular man in America, to advance their cause decades after his death in 1834. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alan. And we'll ask that if people have questions for you, that they'll type them into the chat. And while they're doing that, I would like to share with the audience that we at the Historical Society, like history organizations all across the country, will be commemorating and celebrating the country's 250th anniversary birthday this year. And we will have multiple programs and events focused on the American Revolution. 3 dates I'd like to share now, especially for local folks to keep in mind. Our exhibit is called Revolutionary Little Compton. Our board president, Professor Steve Lubar, is working on it, and he is using primary sources, most especially 83 pension applications from soldiers and widows from Little Compton. And the information in those pension applications is stunning. And it's painting a picture of wartime in Little Compton that we just did not imagine. We thought Little Compton was a calm, safe place. It was not. And Steve will share that information with us this summer. Wow. So please come to the cocktail party, the exhibit preview party on the evening of July 3rd. That is a ticketed event, and tickets will go on sale in June. Please come to our Family Day celebration during the day on July 4th, which is free and open to the public. And there's lots of fun things for children and adults to do that day. And please mark on your calendars Wednesday, August 12th, where Steve will be the speaker at our annual meeting at the Congregational Church in Little Compton. He will present his findings. We will have community members stand up and in their own words tell the story of individuals who lived during the Revolution. And we will have a book launch for Steve's book on life in Little Compton during the Revolution. So lots of exciting things. You're our first exciting thing. You're our first revolutionary thing, Alan, and you're going to kick off a whole summer of revolution.
That Steve's stuff sounds really good.
Steve is really good. I'm going to give you a tidbit. This is one thing. So the widows would write for the widow's pension, and this one woman, and I wish I could remember her name, said, "I am so tired. I was so afraid, and I became so tired of having to pack up my children's clothes and hide them in the reeds to prevent the British soldiers from stealing them." So can you imagine that? The British soldiers were coming over from Newport to Little Compton, not once or twice, but on a regular basis, burning houses, stealing food, stealing livestock, and even stealing children's clothing. What a frightening time. Okay, so a question from an audience member who would like you to say a little bit more about the letter to Jefferson. And I'm not quite sure it was a letter to Jefferson. Was it more perhaps a letter that Lafayette wrote to a friend in America?
No, I quoted a letter to Jefferson in.
Okay, so she would like to know who is the author of that letter.
Well, the letter, if we're talking about the same thing, Jefferson, Jefferson was, other than George Washington, Lafayette's closest American friend, and they corresponded over the years. So in 1821, maybe it was the end of 1820, Jefferson had written to Lafayette about the Missouri situation of the new territories, and Lafayette replied in the letter that I quoted. So the letter that I quoted was written by Lafayette to Jefferson. There's a whole book about the letters between Lafayette and Jefferson.
Okay. So I'm just going to, Christina, if that did not answer your question properly, please write it maybe in a slightly different way, and I will ask it again. Yeah. We have a request for a link to see the recording of the program, where we will be happy to share that. The program will live on the Little Compton Historical Society's YouTube channel. It's going to take us about a week to get that up there. Both Grace and I have to relearn how to do that. The person who did that for us has gone on to bigger and better things, and we have to relearn how to upload onto YouTube.
Maybe bigger, but not better.
Well, thank you. A letter from Laura, a question from Laura. Is there any indication that Lafayette was aware of Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings?
None that I have seen. None that I have seen. But what one learns if one reads about the history of the period, it was pretty commonly known in America anyway, especially during the campaign, the 1800 campaign and 1804 campaign. But I have seen no reference to it in anything, any letters. Let's put it that way.
Okay. A question from Crow, and I'm just going to read it. I'm curious about what is known, if anything, about the camp near Camp Street in Providence between Camp and Hope Streets. Both Lafayette and Rochambeau are remembered with commemorative street names there, as the camp figured greatly during the Revolutionary War.
Yeah. I'm not the right person to answer that question. Maybe Mr. McBurney can answer that one.
Mm-hmm. My question for you, Alan, is can you tell us a little bit, or tell us as much as you can, about Lafayette in the area near Little Compton? Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's any documentation that he came to Little Compton, although there were French troops here.
Yeah.
But can you tell us what he may have done nearby? Maybe Tiverton. Why was there a Lafayette house in Tiverton?
Yeah. So at the end, after the evacuation of Aquidneck Island at the very end of August, Lafayette was put in charge of the defense of the mainland, and he was basically there the month of September. And one of his headquarters was that house in Tiverton. I think he started there because a letter that he wrote, I believe, to Washington, dated September 2, he spells it Tyverton, Tyverton. So he started there. That's probably the closest he got to Tiverton, to Little Compton. So after that, he spent time in Bristol and Warren. In Bristol, the Robinson House, I think it's called, has a big plaque there. And Lafayette stayed there. And I believe there is a place in Warren where he stayed. So he was there the whole month. I think it was punctuated by a couple of trips to Boston, but other than that, he was, is that called the South Coast? Is that what we call that or not?
We're on the South Coast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was there for the month of September. Now, in 1784, he spent a few days in Newport, where he spent time with General Greene and other Revolutionary War veterans. In 1824, he didn't get Newport. They wanted him to come, but he didn't. It was way out of his way. As you know, Newport's out of your way. You know that. You have to go up the peninsula and down the island. But in Providence, there was an officer, Stephen Olney, was still around, and he was the commander of the Rhode Island Regiment during the siege of Yorktown. So he was in command of the African American troops from Rhode Island, and he's still around. And they hugged and spent time together. But he didn't get back to Newport at that time.
All right. Well, seeing no other questions, we'll thank Alan for a very informative evening, and Grace for organizing. And we will, so our next talk is me. Oh, hold on. Last minute question.
All right.
Oh, and I can answer this one, but Alan's the boss.
Before I go, I just want to make a pitch for everyone to join the American Friends of Lafayette. It's a really nice organization. We have a lot of programs, and what we're going to do starting in June of 2027 is to follow Lafayette's footsteps in his American Revolution career. So, for example, we're going to have our annual meeting in Charleston, Georgetown, South Carolina. But during the Revolution, he gets up to at least to Tiverton and Warren, and we'll do something in 1778. I should say 2028 in Rhode Island. So you should be ready for that.
We'll be ready. We also have a question. Did Lafayette know Benjamin Church? And I'm going to say different generations. Benjamin Church died if I remember correctly, in 1717.
Yeah.
So Lafayette was not born during Benjamin Church's lifetime. Now, there was a Dr. Benjamin Church in Boston, a descendant who was a trader.
Right.
So that's, we'll have to learn that story someday.
Yeah.
And now we're getting wonderful thank you notes from people. Question from Martin: was Lafayette's time in Rhode Island coordinated with Rochambeau's arrival of ships and troops? If yes, what was expected of Lafayette's role with regards to Rochambeau's time in Rhode Island?
Okay. So in 1780, after Rochambeau arrives, he arrives in early July 1780. Lafayette did pay a visit on Rochambeau, acting as an emissary from Washington. And they met, and Lafayette, I guess, was a bit pushy and aggressive, and Rochambeau pushed back, and he said, well, I want to meet Washington. So they set up a meeting later between Rochambeau and Washington. So he did come to Newport at that time in 1780. Spent a couple of days there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Have a good evening, everybody. And we expect this to be posted in about a week. Oh,
Right.
I was going to say our next talk is in May, and it's me. And I'm going to do the second half of the history of the Sakonnet Wampanoag people because I was too long-winded during the first half, and I only got to half of it. And great, but Grace, that's in May, but I can't remember what night. Do you remember?
The 20th.
Okay, and that's a Zoom talk, May 20th. Our Zoom only allows 100 people to sign up. So if you're interested in that program, sign up sooner rather than later. It is on our website, littlecompton.org, and you can sign up for that at any time. Okay, so we have more thanks coming through.
Can I make one
Of
comment?
course.
I'm
Yep.
watching some of these comments. On this call is Roy Wolf, who will be the 19-year-old Lafayette in 2027. He is a very accomplished young man. He speaks fluent French. He's musical. He already has a French uniform from the period. And he is coming, I don't know if anyone's in the Boston area, he is going to play the very young Lafayette, the 18-year-old Lafayette, which equals his age, in Boston on May 20th at Massachusetts Lafayette Day, and that's the Massachusetts Lafayette Society. And then he's traveling north to do New Hampshire Lafayette Day, also on May 20th. May 20th was chosen by those two states. It was the day Lafayette died. It's the anniversary.
That sounds great.
Roy is on this call, I saw.
Super. All right. Good evening, everyone. Have a pleasant night, and we hope to see you back at some of our programs either online or in person very soon. Bye-bye.